line is Mathias Osmundsen and Sadi Shanaah. Mathias is from the Department of Political Science and received seed funding to study kind of the interplay between climate change threats and various forms of intergroup relations. I remember this as a project that we immediately thought in the seed funding committee that this is difficult to do, really interesting, and we look already forward to hear about the results. So Mathias and Sadi, please take us away.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I will share the presentation now. It's my first time on Zoom, so bear with me. I'll try to do it. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay. Seems. Try to remove. I don't know what you can see also your videos over the slides. No, so it's only
everything
okay.
is a
Oops, sorry. All right, now you all disappeared, but I'll pretend that I see you. Doesn't matter. Okay, well, hello everyone. As Andreas introduced us, we are a much smaller group of researchers for this particular project. So it's me, Mathias, and Imo Fritsch from Leipzig University. And first of all, I wanted to say right at the beginning, huge thanks to Interacting Mind Center for the financial support, without which we wouldn't be able to do this project. And I dare to say, I hope that we push the boundaries of the current knowledge in this particular area in something that's also quite relevant politically and socially. So hopefully you will not feel it was a waste of money. The title of the presentation is a bit long, The Effect of Climate Change Threat on Intergroup Relations and Support for Violent Extremism. Mostly in this presentation, I will focus on the first half, so the effect of climate change threat on intergroup relations. And towards the end, if I still have time, I can say something on the effect on support for violent extremism. It's simply because we've done much more analysis so far on the former, so we have a bit more to say on that. Okay. How do I move? Oh, now it works. Okay. So what is actually that we are interested in? What is the topic of our research? As the title already gave away, it's climate change, but more specifically, it's the potential of climate change to create conflict between people. And obviously, there is a direct effect of climate change on conflict between people in countries and regions that already experience. I'm sorry, I will try to see some of you because it's a bit not pleasant to talk to empty screen. Try to just visualize some. Well, here. Okay. Sorry for that. It's just much nicer to see some people. Okay. So basically, you have this type of direct effect in regions and countries that are already experiencing negative impact of climate change, right? In the form of extreme weather, droughts, flooding, etc. And understandably, the conflict arises over resources like water or arable land. Also, there are studies on national leaders who are under pressure because of negative effect of climate change on economy and other sectors. And they try to scapegoat certain social groups to divert the attention and the frustration to them, which also can lead to conflict. And there are also studies that show that just a simple increase in temperature in our environment can lead to higher aggressiveness and potential for conflict. But this is not where our research come into. These are these direct effects of climate change in countries that are already suffering now from climate change impacts. What we are interested in is effect of climate change in countries that are not experiencing visible climate change impacts yet, at least, like Northern Europe, like Germany or the United Kingdom, countries that relatively their population is probably less concerned or experiencing less direct effects in terms of water shortage, for example, or flooding. And there is much less studies that have been done in this area, a handful really, but they are showing interesting findings in terms of the subtle psychological effect on population of these countries remote from direct effect of climate change. And these studies show that just reminding people of climate change threat in these countries like Germany or the United Kingdom can lead to increased ethnocentrism, increased authoritarian tendencies, and increased derogation of deviant social groups such as drug dealers, for example, or violent protesters. I actually got the idea about the whole project when I was having this moment when you browse down your Facebook, if you have Facebook screen, and then you have like lots of pop-ups of really dire information about climate change. And I was thinking, okay, if of course it's targeted to me, the Facebook knows my interests, but I mean, nowadays, lots of people are exposed to this information, even if it's just a headline, right? It's sort of apocalyptic, visions of what's gonna happen, and we were thinking, okay, how does that actually impact people's psychology, and then other things that are attached to it, and we look into the existing research, what's out there. And I think it's surely it was this kind of potential effect and the salience of climate change threat to mankind was overshadowed in the last 2 years with COVID pandemic. But I think that might be even helpful to us, because then we can really see the effect of it when it's kind of pure distilled and not perhaps so salient out there, and we can create the salience in our project approach, which is an experimental study. But before that, I wanted just to briefly say something about what scholars think are the underlying mechanisms of this link between climate change threat on one hand, and on the other hand, the potential for conflict between people, or as the studies that got furthest from looking at the potential for conflict was the one that found effect on derogating socially deviant groups, like, as I said, violent protesters or violent offenders or drug dealers. So scholars think that the underlying mechanism is that when people are exposed to threat, even in general to any threat, or of course mortality salience, if you remind people of death, for example, things like that, I think it's a common sort of group of threats. Then people sort of lose the sense of being in control. That's very important to people. They lose sense of security, being even ontological security about, you know, not only future of mankind, but their own future. They play their place in the world. And these are very important psychological needs that people need to fulfill, need to have. And if they experience deprivation of these basic needs, they might turn to, they might intensify their feeling of group membership, belonging to certain social groups, because this collectivity gives them a sense of regaining control, regaining security. They find this sort of palliative, comforting effect in feeling as part of larger group that provides them with some security. It's usually very highly entitative groups, also often kind of authoritative groups, because they provide more sort of order in the chaos, more security. And in turn, they become interested in preserving integrity of these groups, because they provide them with this positive regaining of control and security. So they become interested in preserving integrity of this group, and become kind of defenseless, defensive, of this group to whatever can threaten the integrity and cohesion of these groups. So that's the idea, what's lying behind it. Some parts of it were tested in different studies, but the points in between are sort of not, I would say, tested enough in their entirety. And our research, where does it contribute to this? What do we bring? First of all, we sort of push forward with the dependent variable in statistically speaking. So we want to look at not only potential for derogating certain social groups, but a potential for developing negative attitudes towards minorities, especially ethnic and religious minorities. We already live in a world that's becoming quite tense when it comes to this coexistence of minority and majority minority. So how climate change effect can actually contribute to this sort of potential polarization or potential clash, potential conflict. So we extend this line of research by looking at new, completely new groups, ethnic religious groups, but also a reaction of people of the majority towards refugees, and also specifically climate refugees, because that will probably in the future, we will see an increase of climate refugees, although this category doesn't exist yet legally, strictly speaking, within the UN, but how people would react towards climate refugees when they are exposed to threat of climate change. And secondly, we try to look at a whole list of potential moderators, meaning what specific groups of people from the majority of the society reacts in what way, because there might be that some people who are more authoritarian, the effect on them would be different than people who are less, people who are more left-wing oriented than people who are right-wing oriented, people who have more environmental identity, who care more about environment, might react differently, and so forth. So we had an array of potential moderators, but in this presentation and in the papers that will be output of our research, for this particular part of the research that's interested in the effect on ethnic and religious minorities' attitudes towards them, we will focus on one moderator, which is perceived national climate efficacy, which basically means how people think that their country can cope with climate change. And that's obviously related to a sense of control. With the money from the IMC funding, we procured samples of white British participants for our survey experiments. We had basically 3 waves of surveys that we online surveys. We also used Qualtrics for that, where we targeted the UK majority population, ethnically white British. In the first wave, which is this one, 890 participants, we didn't include any experimental component in that, just collected lots of basic demographics and psychological variables, sort of fishing for potential moderators, based of course on some theories, but we wanted to have a large option for later analysis. And then we recontacted them. That's a bit expensive, so I mean, all of that really we wouldn't be able to do without the funding. So the final sample is 616. That was a successful reconnect, or as much as we can bought for the money. And that's the sample that this is the wave where we included the experimental component, and that's then included in the analysis. And then based on this sort of study, we found out which moderators are the most promising, and then we focus on them in the second study, second wave. That's completely different sample than from the first study. And that was quite recent, actually. In February, we finished the data collection. And what was the experimental component? So obviously, I think some of you are familiar with survey experiments. We divided the participants into 2 conditions in this case, and the ones that were not in the control but were in the treatment group, they read 18 facts about climate change impact on the UK. The pretense was that we are developing a textbook and we just want to know what people know. So they were supposed to tick whether they are familiar with the information or not. Then they were debriefed, obviously, at the end of the survey, what was the real purpose. So they were confronted with these 18 facts about negative climate impacts, which are true on the UK. One example of these 18 is here on the slide. And after this, they also saw a map of United Kingdom in 2050 and estimate what areas will be flooded because of sea level rise, what areas will have problems connected to sea level rise. So we hoped to create some kind of sense of climate change threat from this, whereas the control group just read some facts about United Kingdom geography and history in general, and saw a map of natural parks in the UK. As I said, in this part, we focus on the attitude towards ethnic religious minorities. That was measured on standard thermometer, where participants chose from 1 to 10, 10 being meaning the warmest attitude, the highest We had a range of minorities, like Australians, for example, too, or Germans, but we focus on minorities that are already facing high levels of discrimination, stereotypization. They are already somehow derogated because there the effect would be the strongest, we thought. And these are mainly Muslims, Arabs, and Pakistanis. Also, the exploratory factor analysis shows Chinese also loaded on the same factor in the first study. Not Jews, for example, not Indians. And the solidarity with climate refugees as a dependent variable we measured by asking the participant how much they would be supportive for granting asylum to different kinds of refugees, for example, running from war, running from poverty. It's difficult to sort of define who is climate refugee, but for the purpose of the study, it was the type of refugees that were running away from their country because of sea level rise was threatening their livelihood. So that was close, I think, to the concept of climate refugees. And the moderator that we found was the most important and promising for the future wave and also future studies. The perception of national climate efficacy. In study 1, it was measured only with this sentence, because as I said, we had many different moderators. We were just fishing for the effects for the strongest ones. So the wording was, I think that we in the UK can manage to reduce carbon emissions substantially in order to contribute to the global effort to tackle climate change. It's a bit, it's long and it has a bit different dimensions in it. So when we found out that this a bit of proxy to collective control is actually quite important, in study 2, we developed a proper scale. There is nothing like that existing before, so we sort of developed a scale including that included 6 items that spanned 3 dimensions: how much the country and the people are committed to the goal of fighting climate change, how much people feel that there is actually some action towards oriented towards fulfilling this goal going on, and finally the belief that this action will actually reach the goal of mitigating climate change. And here quickly for the results. So the effect as such, the direct effect, without any moderation, we found a negative one, as we hypothesized. So participants in the survey that were in the treatment group ranked ethnic and minority groups, specifically Muslim, Arabs, Chinese, and Pakistanis in the first study, more negatively than people that were not exposed to climate change threat reminder, but it hasn't reached statistical significance. What was statistically significant was the effect through the moderator of national climate efficacy. So you could see these 2 graphs. The one on the left is from study 1. The graph on the right is from study 2. The green line is the treatment group. So people with low climate efficacy, people who didn't much believe that their country will cope well, or is trying to actually fight climate change. Those people, when exposed to climate change threat, significantly ranked minorities significantly less positively than those in control group. The same for this more elaborated measure of climate efficacy in study 2. Both interaction effects were statistically significant. When it comes to climate refugees, again, we didn't find a direct significant effect, but again, we found significant interaction with the perception of national climate efficacy. So people with low climate efficacy were less accepting or less willing to grant asylum to climate refugees than those in the control group. And conversely, people with strong sense of climate efficacy were more willing to grant asylum in the treatment group, which is a bit interesting. Why is that? We can talk about the right side of these graphs. Why and what does it mean? So to conclude, at least this part of the focus of the research on ethnic minorities, not on the violent extremism part, I would say that we really provide first empirical evidence of the effect of climate change on majority-minority relations. Potential for hostility or conflict is there. Again, it's for countries that are not directly yet experiencing negative climate change impact, countries like the UK, where we conducted this study. And this is quite new and also worrying. We also, for the first time, established that the perception of climate efficacy is important and functions as a moderator, which also means that there are some potentials for positive interventions. For example, when it comes to how governments communicate climate change threat, because ironically, people would think that scaring people by telling them, how badly it will look like if we don't do any action, and by this scare tactics, maybe governments, maybe NGOs think that they can mobilize people for some positive action. It can also be true that they can create more hostility between different social groups, actually. So there needs to be some calibration of what messages are going out there to the public and how exactly. And as I said, I can briefly talk about the second focus, which will be, I think, second paper output, second article of this project, where the dependent variable is not relations between majority minority or support for asylum seekers, climate refugees, but this article would be more targeted for terrorism, political violence journals, where we look at support for now I should say that, in the title of the presentation was violent extremism, and we can spend hours discussing what is extremism and what is violent extremism. The violent part, I think we will do away, because it's basically about extreme pro-climate action measured by things like sabotaging or threatening CEOs of big emitting, polluting companies, or blockading coal mines and things like that. How much people justify this kind of action was the measure. So, for example, blockading coal power plants, I don't think that can be qualified as violent extremism. So we'll be careful with the language here. We also look at support for sort of, we can term it far-right environmentalism or ecofascism, ecofascist action. It's difficult to come up with a measure. This whole concept is fascinating of ecofascism, but we measure it so far with one item, which is sort of how much people justify other private initiatives, private groups patrolling neighborhood areas that are predominantly immigrant to sort of punish immigrants who are littering, who are throwing garbage or rubbish in the streets, because that's one of the things that eco-fascists are also talking about as immigrants, kind of when they are trying to connect far-right discourse and concern for environment, which is a fascinating new thing. There is no more a denial of climate change in the young generation of far-right activists, at least not everyone. We see some, push for actually linking concern for environment, concern for climate change with far-right discourse on immigration and nationalism. This is and also area that's completely, there is nothing, no data, even descriptive on how much support among population is for some eco-fascist idea and eco-fascist action. So I think here, even when we come with descriptives, it will be quite valuable for this line of research, again, terrorism, political violence. And here, it's not the perception of climate efficacy much that seems to be important, but rather for the pro-climate action like sabotaging, blockading, or threatening coal power plants or oil industry. We see that environmental identity, and it's quite logical, it's quite important. The more people have, the higher they have environmental identity, the more they are capable of justifying this kind of actions. For the ecofascism part, it's mostly about political efficacy. If they feel not politically efficacious, not having impact, not being able to do anything about politics, politicians not listening to them, not having effect, not being in control, their voice not being heard, the more they are supportive of eco-fascist actions and ideology. Also the same with sort of right-wing authoritarian orientation, multiculturalism. So it's predominantly, of course, the political far-right component of the political ideology landscape. But what is interesting here, probably final sentence, the extreme pro-climate action, so sort of extremist action that's motivated with the effort to fight climate change, to do something positive for the planet, which I think in the lay discourse or in the normal thinking is more linked to left-wing activists and left-wing movements. Is not, we didn't find that it's actually significantly correlated to left-wing or right-wing. We see both groups of left-wing and right-wing oriented people capable of justifying these actions equally. Okay, and with that, again, big thanks to the funding and the opportunity to do this research.
Thank you, Sadi. It's a really, really amazing presentation on so many levels. On a structural plane, the fact that you can use the seed funding to build and maintain international networks is just exemplary. And I think on the content side, you're pointing to something that's deeply interesting in terms of some notion of kind of agency or perceived agency being critical in dealing with these kind of major societal changes, right? And I think the shift that you see from, on one hand, that there is an immediate shift from denial there is not a problem out there to fatality. Well, there is nothing we can do about it anyway. Precisely kind of black boxes, that space in the middle where there are possibilities both for individual and for personal and for societal change. And I think it's a very interesting point worthy of further pursue, and actually something that we have also seen to connect to Niels Christian's talk in the COVID-19 research that we're doing, where precisely, there are some very kind of odd alliances between people on the extreme right and people on the extreme left in terms of having particular ideas about both what is COVID-19 about and what should be the right societal responses. So, we need kind of other models for understanding what mobilizes populations and what creates spaces for actions in the current crisis. It simply doesn't look like the textbooks any longer. But with that, I mean, let's open up for some discussions. We have time for a few questions. Any questions or comments? Yeah, Martin?
Sorry, yeah, thanks for a very interesting presentation. It was just more of a comment, really, that I had. It made me wonder about this story of, or narrative of how the Syrian conflict or war was caused by drought, a long-standing drought, right? And how that's since been repudiated in a few studies, that there is a correlation between the two. But the problem itself, though, I wonder if that's interesting for you to pursue or to look at how to any extent, if there is one, is this sort of conflict something that we can sort of track going back in earlier conflicts? I mean, the whole migration question around scarce resources, political conflict leading to war, or perhaps leading to extremism, and then in the extent leading to war, right? Is that something you would find remotely interesting to look at related to your studies as well, that sort of historical connection?
In general, yes. I mean, I find it interesting. I'm not sure how to connect it with the current sort of line of the project, because that would, I mean, either you look at the roots of these conflicts and migration flows being in partially caused by climate change, right? Yeah, we would need to, obviously we kind of are done with the data collection, but somehow to tease out, yeah, what part of potential hostility towards different groups of people is based on fear of competition over resources. So yeah, so I'm not completely sure if I get the specific sort of direction that you wanted me to think about, but there is it's a huge area. I just found it interesting that climate change threat can affect people who have no reason to be afraid personally yet about climate change, right? So it's to some extent it's a general reaction to kind of general feeling of any threat, but when we look at the moderation by perception of how the country can cope with climate change specifically, so it's not just any threat, right? It's the climate change thing, because we also primed it in the experiment. So, and we also primed I mean the national thing, because the facts were about United Kingdom, not about the world. We didn't make the participants to read about climate change effect on the whole world, but specifically about the UK. And that's why we might have created also high salience for groupness on the national level, and also impact of perception of efficacy on the national level. But it's interesting also there are some studies that you know, they try to increase when you talk about climate change, when you talk about not the country but the effect globally, and bring in you create the feeling that we are all in it, and it's the impact it's on mankind, and you create different groups differently salient, then you might mitigate also this effect that we are finding. As I said, it's a lot about how you communicate this and what is contextually at the moment salient to people. So if you prime them with nation, then they curiously enough, we didn't replicate the effect on the derogated dangerous groups like drug dealers, or these are all national groups. And perhaps because we were so much priming the national context, then you know, some people that are negatively predisposed to these social groups like drug dealers, etc., they would think, well, they are part of us, right? They are part of the nation, and they become more derogative to other outgroups that are suddenly not in this context defined as part of our group. So I think it's also interesting to see this kind of different effect on, depending on how what you connect the climate change threat with in the communication. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry for just